Jack, Mayor and Council. We've been talking a lot about new and missing infrastructure.
Your mic.
Well, I think it's on.
Now it's on. Thank you. Testing. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the existing infrastructure that we have, some of these assets that are sometimes many years old, as Jack said, 50s and 60s in vintage. So there's some degrading that goes on, and of course, as our standards change, Dave Byers mentioned ADA ramps as an example. As the standards go up, as we go out and do improvements on the roadway, sometimes we're required to bring those up to new standards. For example, if you do an asphalt overlay and the ped ramps that are out there do not meet the current standard, you have to include that in your project. It's required in order to get the funding. Sidewalks are often narrow or gravel or asphalt material. And as you look around Western Chula Vista, there's lots of cracking. Faulting, as concrete ages, it gets more brittle. And with loads, over time it happens. Cross gutters is another issue. Many of our older streets, as traffic volumes increased, we sometimes added traffic signals, but the dips are still there. So you might have a traveling with 25, 30, 35 miles an hour. People don't know the road. There's a little bit of a dip. You might remember East Street at first, before we made the improvements there. That street was quite scarred by the folks that learned the hard way. This slide depicts an example of where, in fact, this is on East 8th Street, so it's about 20 years old. It's not as old as some of the streets in Western Chula Vista, but even in the east we have problems. This sidewalk is faulted, but as Jack was mentioning, most of these sidewalks are built by developers and by private citizens. And in fact, the Streets and Highway Codes requires those owners to maintain these. But it hasn't been necessarily our practice. We have street trees out there that sometimes damage sidewalks, so the city takes ownership of that, and city crews have gone out and made repairs on those. But it's not, in accordance with the Streets and Highway Codes, required of the city. So it's another choice that maybe we need to take another look at when we talk about covering all the improvements and repairs. We did have a city crew, as I understand from Mr. Byers, until the mid-90s, that worked on PCC sidewalks. It was a concrete crew, but because of budget concerns at that time, it was cut. And since that time, we've had about $100,000 each year that we put into contracts to make repairs throughout the city. And numbers stayed about the same. Now, it has been augmented with CDBG money, but that's a short-lived thing, and it's not going to last forever. The needs continue to rise. This picture shows you one of the faulted sidewalks. It's about close to 2 or a little over 2 inches where the fault is. And this is a tripping hazard. The prima facie evidence for tripping hazards is 1 3/4 inches. So legally in the courts that's been tested. Sharon, I understand you verified that with Dave earlier.
Oh, I only testified by the language.
Okay. But I mean, the fact of the matter is, these are increasing, and the city's position on these is we go out and try to find them, but we depend a lot on service requests. As citizens call in and say, hey, we've got a problem with the sidewalk. We also have volunteers that have done surveys in the last few years. And now with the walking audits that we're going to do with Safe Schools, it's another opportunity for us to gather data on where all these faults and problems are. All of that information is being collected and put into our data system in Public Works and putting on the list. We're about 3 to 4 years in the rears on taking care of all the tripping hazards. But because it's an immediate liability, not necessarily to the city, but to the public and to possibly the property owner that is technically responsible to maintain that sidewalk, the city takes a position to go out and wedge the sidewalks. You can see in this picture, we have an asphalt crew that goes out where these areas are identified, and they put an asphalt wedge to temporarily alleviate the tripping hazard or minimize it. And this is a Band-Aid. The repair, as I said, is 3 to 4 years currently in the works. But this is an example.
Rick, do you have just a ballpark figure of what it costs when you go out and you notice a trip hazard is reported to you? Your crew goes out and inspects it, comes back and does this kind of work. Do you have any idea of a dollar figure for something like that?
We have two-person crews, and sometimes the wedging is what we use. Other times we have a PCC grinder. So if the fault isn't that bad, we grind it off. But typically the crew will spend between half hour to an hour and a half, depending on what they need to do. For a two-person crew in a truck, what does that do?
Maybe about $100 if you include it.
But that gets it to this temporary fix.
That's right.
If a property owner, I mean, this is a sidewalk in front of somebody's home, and they, can they contract with you and pay that, whatever that extra fee is? I mean, nobody's gonna look at that and say this is a great looking sidewalk. It's much safer, obviously, than it was before. But do they have the opportunity to come up and say, look, I'd like this redone with concrete, and can they contract with you to pay for it?
Since we don't use a concrete crew any longer in Public Works, we contract for all of our work, so it can be, and in fact, we have done it in time. And sometimes when we have a crew out, a project out, if someone approaches us, we can work with the contractor, say, hey, can you reach a deal with this property owner and do their work for them. Typically though, because we use state or federal funding with grants, it's prevailing wage, and actually the property owner can do better cost-wise if they contract for themselves. So there may be an economy of scale if it's a lot, but typically it's not.
I was just going to mention, when we were doing the Nathan or the Tobias and Dixon Street jobs years ago in Castle Park, a number of the property owners approached us and said, can we'd like to get some other stuff done, and so we'll tell them you can work out an arrangement with the contractor, but we have to be careful that the scope of their work doesn't go outside the scope of our contract, because then we get into change order situation. But we do try to help people out in those sorts of cases. The other difficult part about sidewalks, as Rick mentioned, is about $100,000 a year. We used to be able to use CDBG for sidewalk rehab. We can use it for installing sidewalk, but we can't use it for rehabs anymore, or housing and urban redevelopment. It made it clear that CDBG money should not be used for the sort of routine maintenance that you see here. And so that $100,000 was augmented most years by about $100,000 in CDBG, but that second $100,000 is essentially taken away.
John, did you have a question?
Thanks, Rick. I was actually going to ask you about the grinding, because in some circumstances I see where the city will actually grind part of the sidewalk down. What is sort of the decision or rule of thumb in using that, and why can't you use the grinder on the larger wedges?
I'll take the second question first. If you have a big fault and you grind off the concrete to make it smooth, then you have a very thin piece of concrete that's left behind, which is subject to breaking off and then becoming another hazard. So it's some judgment by the crew, especially if it's been ground several times over the years. But they try to get as much life as they can out of that pavement. The grinding is a fairly quick operation, so it's cost effective to band-aid it at that point. In fact, when property owners acknowledge that it's their responsibility, we had the golf course out at a country club that has recently done grinding and also done they're getting ready to do some slab replacements on the sidewalk in front of their property. And they used a lot of grinding. So we say, okay, that's okay, but if it breaks again in a few years, then you're going to have to replace the slab, and they acknowledge that. So it is a good strategy, but it is temporary.
Thank you.
May I ask, Mayor? How practical is it for a property owner, a private property owner, to do a repair like that? I mean, would they need to get a permit? Is that required? Yes,
in the public right-of-way, they are required to use a licensed contractor and work with the city to make sure that we inspect it and make sure that it's built according to our needs, because we have an obligation to protect the public. It is in the public right-of-way. So just as when the builder initially does it, they have inspection. Anytime someone's making improvements in the public right-of-way, we require a permit. Now, one thing that we have found that will help people, and Risk Management approached Public Works about this about 2 years ago, other cities were requiring their property owners to make these repairs, but they weren't just dumping it on them. They said, go talk to your insurance company, because if there's a tripping hazard in front of somebody's house, your homeowner's insurance, your liability portion of that, should cover that. And in fact, we've had a number of people tell us that that was the case.